Matthew Collins, a devoted husband, is captivated by the allure of Isabelle Dupont, a seductive French beauty. Their passionate affair ignites like wildfire, but shadows of suspicion loom back home as his wife, Rachel, begins to sense something is amiss. What will happen when secrets unravel and confrontations ignite? As emotions flare and the stakes rise, can love survive the ultimate betrayal? Or will it lead to an irreversible act of desperation? Dive into this gripping tale of forbidden passion and devastating consequences where a moment of rage shatters a world built on desire. The hum of Paris surrounded Matthew Collins the moment he stepped out of the sleek black car and into the crisp evening air. The city hummed with life, its lights twinkling like diamonds against the backdrop of a fading sunset. He inhaled deeply, savoring the unique mix of history, elegance, and temptation that clung to every street corner. Despite the excitement of his business trip, a familiar emptiness tugged at him, a loneliness he had grown used to in his marriage. Paris, however, felt different, its air thick with the possibility of something more, something dangerous. After a long day of meetings, Matthew found himself restless, unable to head back to his hotel room just yet. The idea of a quiet drink in a charming Parisian cafe tugged at him like an irresistible whisper. His mind raced with thoughts of Rachel back home, loyal, loving Rachel, who had no idea that the distance between them had been growing like a silent chasm. But as much as guilt gnawed at him, it wasn't strong enough to keep him from wandering through the cobbled streets, soaking in the intoxicating energy of the city. That's when he saw her. Isabelle Dupont. She was seated at a small table near the corner of a quaint cafe, the golden light from inside spilling onto her like a spotlight. Her legs, crossed elegantly, were wrapped in a flowing dress that seemed to cling to her curves in all the right places. Long, chestnut hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her eyes, a captivating shade of emerald, glimmered with mischief as she sipped her glass of wine. Matthew hesitated, struck by how effortlessly alluring she looked. The woman didn't just belong in Paris, she was Paris, the embodiment of the city's seductive charm. She caught his gaze, her lips curving into a knowing smile, a smile that sent a thrill through him that he hadn't felt in years. With no plan, no thought of consequences, Matthew stepped into the cafe. His pulse quickened as he approached her, every step heightening the sense of something forbidden, something inevitable. Their eyes met again, this time with more intention. It was as though they were communicating without words, as if they both knew exactly where this night was heading. Bonsoir, he greeted, his voice low and filled with a confidence he hadn't felt in a long time. Bonsoir, Isabelle replied, her French accent smooth and inviting. She didn't shy away, instead she gestured to the empty chair across from her. Join me, monsieur. You look like you could use a drink. Matthew smiled, his heart racing as he slid into the seat. There was a spark between them, an invisible thread of desire that pulled them closer with every glance, every shared breath. He ordered a glass of red wine, though it hardly mattered, he was already intoxicated by her presence. I'm Matthew, he said, trying to play it cool, though his pulse betrayed him. Isabelle, she responded, her voice dripping with elegance. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze lingering on him for a beat longer than was proper. What brings you to Paris, Matthew? Business, he replied, though in that moment, all thoughts of work had evaporated. His focus was entirely on her, on the way her fingers delicately traced the rim of her glass, on the way her lips parted ever so slightly when she smiled. But I'm starting to think there's more to this trip than business. Isabelle leaned forward, the neckline of her dress dipping just enough to hint at more. Oh, and what else could you be looking for? The tension between them was thick, the air almost electric. They spoke in hushed tones, but their words were laced with unspoken promises. Matthew felt his breath catch every time Isabelle's hand brushed against his under the table. Each accidental touch sent a jolt of desire through him, his mind racing with the possibilities of what the night could become. Minutes turned into hours as they exchanged stories, flirtations, and secretive smiles. The wine flowed freely, but it was the chemistry between them that truly set the evening on fire. Matthew couldn't remember the last time he'd felt such a pull towards someone, such a dangerous desire coursing through his veins. As the night deepened, the streets of Paris grew quieter, but inside the cafe, the heat between them only intensified. Isabelle looked at him, her eyes dark with intent. Walk with me, she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath, but it held the weight of a command. Matthew didn't hesitate. They left the cafe, the cool Parisian air doing nothing to calm the inferno burning inside him. They wandered down narrow cobblestone streets, the city's lights casting long shadows, but neither of them cared where they were going. With every step, their bodies drew closer, hands brushing against each other, until Isabel boldly slipped her fingers through his. And then, beneath the soft glow of a street lamp, she stopped. Facing him, she looked up into his eyes, her lips parting slightly as she stepped closer. Her perfume a mix of jasmine and something impossibly French wrapped around him, making him dizzy with desire. Without another word, Isabel stood on her toes, her lips grazing his in a way that was both tentative and electric, as though daring him to close the gap. Matthew didn't resist. His hands found her waist, pulling her against him as their lips collided in a kiss that was slow, sensual, and filled with everything they hadn't said. The heat between them exploded, their mouths moving in sync as though they'd been waiting for this moment all night. Her hands tangled in his hair, and his fingers traced the curve of her spine, each touch a promise of what was to come. Time stood still as they kissed under the Parisian sky, the world around them fading into oblivion. There was only the warmth of her body against his, the softness of her lips, and the intoxicating mix of guilt and thrill that pulsed through his veins. Every part of him knew this was dangerous, but in that moment, Matthew didn't care. All that mattered was the way Isabel made him feel alive, something he hadn't felt in far too long. When they finally pulled apart, their breaths ragged, Isabel's eyes sparkled with a dangerous glint. She trailed her fingers down his chest, her touch lingering as if to mark him. "Tomorrow night," she whispered, her voice sultry and filled with promise. "Meet me here again." Matthew nodded, his mind swirling with the possibilities of where this affair could lead. He watched her disappear into the night, the taste of her kiss still burning on his lips. As he turned and walked back to his hotel, his heart raced with excitement, but beneath the thrill, a darker thought lingered. This was more than just a fling. This was the beginning of something that could unravel everything. And deep down, Matthew knew there was no turning back. The days that followed Matthew's first night with Isabel unfolded like a fevered dream. His mind, once preoccupied with boardroom meetings and business negotiations, now only wandered to her the way her lips tasted of wine, how her laugh seemed to dance on the air, and the hypnotic sway of her hips as she walked away into the Parisian night. He hadn't planned to see her again. He hadn't planned on any of this. But Isabel had woven herself into his thoughts like a seductive spell he had no desire to break. They met in secret, their rendezvous always cloaked in whispers and half-lies. Matthew would make a hurried phone call to his assistant about another meeting before rushing through the city streets, his pulse racing not from business, but from the thought of Isabel waiting for him. He'd reach her apartment, or sometimes a quiet cafe tucked away from the main boulevards, and she would be there, her eyes glinting with the same hungry desire that mirrored his own. Paris was their playground, and they made full use of its hidden corners. There were kisses stolen in the shadows of the Notre Dame, his hands tangled in her hair as they pressed against ancient stone walls. There were secret touches exchanged in dimly lit art galleries, where the beauty of the paintings was nothing compared to the electric heat between them. The city became a maze of passion, and no matter where they went, they found ways to lose themselves in each other. One afternoon, they found themselves in a private suite that overlooked the Eiffel Tower, the iconic landmark casting a shimmering glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Matthew stood by the window, his shirt already unbuttoned, watching as Isabel slowly approached him. Her silk dress whispered against her skin, and with each step, the space between them seemed to vanish, the tension growing thicker with every second. The air between them was suffocating, thick with anticipation and the thrill of knowing how wrong this was, yet craving it all the same. Isabel's hand slid up his chest, her fingers tracing the lines of his muscles, making his breath hitch. She smiled a dangerous, sultry smile that made him weak and leaned in, her lips barely brushing his ear. "You're thinking about her, aren't you?" Matthew tensed for a moment, the image of Rachel flashing through his mind, his wife, his real life. But it was fleeting, washed away by the warmth of Isabel's body pressed against his. "Not tonight," he whispered, his voice thick with desire, his hands gripping her waist as he pulled her against him, erasing any lingering doubt. Their lips collided with an intensity that left them both breathless. The kiss was hungry, desperate, a mixture of passion and possession. Matthew's hands roamed her body, fingers sliding over the smooth silk of her dress, feeling the heat of her skin beneath. Isabel responded with equal fervor, her nails grazing his back as she deepened the kiss, making a soft moan escape from his throat. They moved in a tangled rhythm, shedding clothes and inhibitions, until there was nothing left between them but bare skin and raw desire. The city's lights sparkled through the window, casting their entwined bodies in a golden glow. Matthew lifted Isabel, carrying her to the plush bed in the center of the room, laying her down gently as though she were a treasure too precious to rush. But the fire inside him couldn't be tamed. He wanted her, needed her in ways that went beyond reason. Isabel's eyes darkened with lust as she pulled him down to her, her legs wrapping around him, her hands guiding him in the rhythm they'd both come to crave. Their bodies moved together, slowly at first, savoring the feel of each other, the intimate connection growing deeper with every thrust, every kiss. The sounds of their lovemaking filled the room's soft gasps, whispered names, and the heady pulse of hearts beating in time. For hours, they explored every inch of each other, the sheets a tangled mess beneath them as they found new ways to stoke the flames of their desire. It wasn't just physical. The way Matthew looked at Isabel, the way she smiled at him in those moments of quiet after, it was as if they had slipped into a world that existed outside of everything. Outside of his marriage, outside of his responsibilities. Here, in this secret life, they were free to indulge in every forbidden fantasy. But even in the midst of their passion, there was a shadow that loomed over Matthew. Late at night, when Isabel would fall asleep beside him, her body curled against his mind would wander back to Rachel, back to his home. The guilt gnawed at him like a parasite, a small voice in the back of his mind reminding him that what he was doing couldn't last. But then Isabel would stir, her lips brushing his neck, her hands seeking him out, and the guilt would melt away, replaced by the heat of the moment. Days bled into nights, and each encounter felt more dangerous than the last. Matthew was no longer the man who arrived in Paris for a simple business trip. He was caught in Isabel's web, drawn deeper into the affair with every stolen moment. There were dinners in candlelit restaurants, where their feet tangled beneath the table and their hands found each other under white tablecloths. There were long walks by the Seine, where they would stop under the cover of darkness to share searing kisses that left them both breathless. They lived for these moments, these brief, perfect slices of passion in a city made for lovers. And yet, there was something different about Isabel. Each time they met, there was a hunger in her eyes that grew, a possessiveness that wrapped around him like a vice. She spoke less about their future together, but her actions told him all he needed to know. She wanted more. She wanted everything. One evening, as they lay together in bed, the Eiffel Tower twinkling in the distance, Isabel traced lazy circles on his chest. "You belong here with me, Matthew," she whispered, her voice soft but edged with certainty. Not with her. Not in that life. Matthew tensed, guilt flooding him once more. But when Isabel's lips found his, when her body moved against his with the ease of someone who had already claimed him, that guilt became a distant memory. In the secret corners of Paris, they continued their affair, reckless, passionate, and consuming. But deep inside, Matthew knew the thrill couldn't last. Something had to give, and when it did, he feared it would shatter everything. For now, though, he was lost in her, the taste of her lips, the feel of her skin, the dangerous promise of what they had. And as long as he was with Isabel, nothing else mattered. Back home, the silence in the house felt heavier than usual. Rachel Collins sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The house was empty, eerily quiet without the usual buzz of Matthew's presence. He had always traveled for business. This trip to Paris was nothing out of the ordinary, but there was something about this time that felt different. It wasn't just the distance, it was him. Matthew's calls, once frequent and filled with light banter about his day, had become shorter, his voice more distant, and often distracted. Rachel had always been good at reading him better than he realized. She could tell when something was wrong, when his mind was elsewhere, when the unspoken things between them were louder than the words they exchanged. And now, something was definitely wrong. She traced her finger absent-mindedly along the rim of her mug, her thoughts swirling. There had been nights when he would call, but his voice seemed miles away, and she could hear the faint hum of something in the background voices, the clink of glasses, laughter. It had been enough to stir her unease, enough to make her wonder. But it was the way he had begun to speak to her. as though she were a duty he needed to fulfill, that set off alarms in her heart. The warm affection that once filled their conversations had been replaced by something cold, something mechanical. She hated this feeling, the gnawing suspicion that crept into her thoughts at night when she lay alone in their bed, staring at the empty side where he should have been. Rachel wasn't the type to be paranoid, but there were things she couldn't ignore. She knew Matthew better than anyone, and something had shifted. Something dark and unspoken now lingered between them, and it was tearing her apart. Her fingers brushed against the frame of an old photo on the windowsill, and her heart clenched. It was a picture of them from years ago, long before the demands of work and life had pulled them in different directions. Rachel looked at the image, her younger self smiling up at Matthew, her eyes bright with love and excitement. They had been so happy then, so completely in sync. The memory washed over her like a bittersweet wave. It was their 3rd anniversary, and they had taken a spontaneous trip to the coast. Rachel could still remember the salty sea air, the feel of Matthew's arms around her as they walked along the beach, barefoot and carefree. The sand had been cool under their feet, but the warmth between them had been palpable. "I can't believe it's been 3 years," Matthew had said, pulling her close, his lips brushing against her temple as they stopped to watch the sun sink into the horizon. "Time flies when you're having fun," Rachel had teased, her fingers lacing through his as they stood there, basking in the moment. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was rhythmic, soothing, and she had never felt more at peace than in his arms. He had kissed her, then slow, lingering, and filled with all the love they had built together. His hands had cradled her face, his touch gentle but firm, the kind that made her feel safe, cherished. She remembered the way her heart had fluttered as their lips met, the heat that had spread between them as his hands drifted to the small of her back, pulling her closer until there was no space left between their bodies. That night, in a small seaside inn, they had made love with a tenderness that felt as new and exciting as the first time. Their connection had always been deep, built on trust, respect, and an undeniable passion for each other. They had been so in love. But now, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the Matthew from those years ago was slipping away. Each call from Paris felt more forced, more scripted, and her heart ached with the thought that he might be hiding something. She had brushed it off at first, telling herself that it was just her imagination, that she was reading too much into his distracted tone. But as the days wore on, the unease gnawed at her, refusing to be silenced. The final straw had been last night. She had called him late, hoping to catch him between meetings, but when he answered, his voice had been distant, hurried. "I'm sorry, Rach. I'm in the middle of something. Can I call you back later?" And then, before she could even respond, the call had ended. Just like that. No "I love you," no "good night," nothing. Rachel had sat there, staring at the phone in disbelief, the weight of her suspicions crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. She had lain awake for hours, replaying every conversation, every little moment that felt off, trying to piece together the fragments of their strained relationship. Her intuition, the part of her that had always been finely attuned to Matthew, screamed that he was hiding something. And that's when she made her decision. Rachel wasn't the type to sit back and wait for answers. She had always been strong, determined, and fiercely protective of her marriage. If Matthew was hiding something from her, she needed to know what it was. And there was only one way to find out. Grabbing her laptop, she quickly booked a flight to Paris, her fingers trembling as she confirmed the details. Her heart raced with a mixture of fear and determination. She had never imagined herself as the kind of wife who would follow her husband across the world out of suspicion, but here she was, taking action. She couldn't sit idly by and watch her marriage unravel without a fight. As she packed her bags, memories of their early romance flooded her mind's soft kisses in the kitchen as they made breakfast together, the feel of his arms around her as they danced in the living room to their favorite song, the way he used to look at her like she was the only woman in the world. Those moments felt so distant now, but they were still there, buried beneath the cracks that had formed between them. With a heavy heart, Rachel zipped her suitcase shut and stood in the doorway of their bedroom. She glanced at the empty bed, the silence of the house pressing down on her like a weight. She was going to Paris, and one way or another, she was going to find out the truth. But deep down, Rachel feared what she might discover. And even more than that, she feared what it might mean for the love they once shared. As she closed the door behind her, The echoes of their early romance still lingered in her mind, a painful reminder of what was at stake. The streets of Paris buzzed with life as Rachel stepped out of the taxi, her heart pounding against her chest. The city was just as beautiful as she remembered, the scent of freshly baked bread wafting through the air, the cobblestones glistening under the soft golden light of the setting sun. But Rachel was in no state to appreciate it. Her mind was singularly focused on one thing: Matthew. Her flight had been long, the hours stretched out with endless possibilities of what she might find. Would Matthew be alone, simply lost in work, and all her fears unfounded? Or had her worst suspicions been right all along? The possibility of him in another woman's arms was a thought she couldn't bear, but it haunted her all the way to Paris. With every step she took toward Isabel's apartment, an address she'd found scribbled on a piece of paper in Matthew's home office, Rachel's nerves tightened. Her body was coiled like a spring, ready to explode with the raw emotion she had bottled up since that final phone call. She could barely hear the world around her. The sounds of Paris, the laughter, the street musicians, the clinking of wine glasses faded into the background, drowned out by the roaring storm inside her. When she reached the apartment building, Rachel paused. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse as she stared at the ornate door. This was it. Inside those walls, the truth waited for her, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. But there was no turning back now. She had come this far. Rachel inhaled sharply and pushed the door open, her heels clicking on the marble floors of the building's lobby. Her heart raced faster with each step she took up the winding staircase, the quiet of the hallway around her deafening. When she reached Isabel's door, her hand hovered over the handle for a moment. Her breath was shallow, the anticipation unbearable. She didn't knock. She couldn't. The thought of waiting, of giving them a chance to prepare themselves, was unthinkable. She needed to see to catch them, now. Her fingers trembled as she turned the knob, pushing the door open, stepping into the apartment unannounced. The scene that greeted her was a nightmare come to life. Matthew was there, his shirt half unbuttoned, his body pressed against Isabel's as they stood by the large window that overlooked the glittering Eiffel Tower in the distance. His hands cradled her face, his lips inches from hers, their breaths mingling in a moment of heated anticipation. Isabel's slender fingers traced the line of Matthew's jaw, her eyes dark with desire, and in that instant, Rachel felt her world collapse. The betrayal hit her like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of her. Her vision blurred as the rage, the hurt, the overwhelming sense of loss surged through her veins like fire. Matthew, her voice sliced through the air, sharp and full of fury. Matthew and Isabel jumped apart, their faces filled with shock. The color drained from Matthew's face as he met Rachel's gaze, his mouth opening to say something, anything, but nothing came. The silence was suffocating. Rachel's chest heaved as she took in the scene before her, the woman, with her dark hair falling in loose waves around her bare shoulders, her lips still slightly swollen from the kiss she had shared with Rachel's husband. And Matthew. Her Matthew, standing there like a deer caught in the headlights, guilt and shame written all over his face. "What the hell is going on?" Rachel demanded, her voice shaking with the weight of her disbelief, her fury. "This is why you've been distant. This is why you've been lying to me." Matthew took a step toward her, his hands raised in a placating gesture, but the words he tried to form fell flat. "Rachel, it's not. I didn't." "Don't you dare," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "Don't you dare try to explain this away." Isabel, standing behind Matthew, looked at Rachel with an air of defiance. Her beauty, the very thing that had drawn Matthew in, now felt like a slap to Rachel's face. Isabel didn't seem frightened or ashamed, if anything. She was calm, as though this confrontation was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "This is between me and my husband," Rachel snapped, her eyes narrowing on Isabel. "Stay out of it." Isabel raised an eyebrow, her French accent dripping with condescension. "Your husband didn't seem too concerned about that when he was in my bed." The words hit Rachel like a physical blow, cutting deep into her already shattered heart. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on her as the truth she had feared stood before her in flesh and blood. All the nights she had spent agonizing over Matthew's distance, all the moments she had hoped against hope that she was wrong, it had all been for nothing. Without thinking, Rachel lunged forward, her hands trembling with the force of her emotions. Matthew stepped between them, trying to hold her back, but she shoved him aside, her fury laser-focused on Isabel. "You bitch," Rachel screamed, her voice cracking with the intensity of her grief and betrayal. "You ruined everything." Isabel smirked, folding her arms across her chest as if she were untouchable. "If it wasn't me, it would have been someone else. Your marriage was already falling apart. You just didn't want to see it." The arrogance, the lack of remorse in Isabel's voice, pushed Rachel over the edge. She lunged at Isabel again, her hands reaching for her, desperate to release the pain that was tearing her apart. The two women struggled, their bodies colliding in a whirlwind of rage and hurt, their movements frantic and wild. Matthew's voice was a distant echo in the chaos, his pleas to stop drowned out by the sound of Rachel's heart pounding in her ears. She felt Isabel's nails dig into her skin as they grappled, but Rachel was beyond feeling, beyond caring. All she could see was the woman who had taken everything from her. In the frenzy, they moved closer to the staircase. The fight was chaotic grabs, shoves, the air thick with the sound of labored breathing and angry cries. And then, in one devastating moment, it happened. Rachel's hands, slick with sweat and shaking with adrenaline, pushed Isabel harder than she intended. The force sent Isabel stumbling back, her feet catching on the edge of the stairwell. Her eyes widened in shock, her arms flailing as she lost her balance. And then she was gone, tumbling down the long, winding staircase, her scream echoing through the apartment as she fell. The sound of her body hitting the bottom was sickening, final. Rachel stood frozen at the top of the stairs, her chest heaving, her hands still trembling from the fight. She could barely process what had just happened. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: fear, shock, disbelief. She glanced at Matthew, who was staring down at Isabel's motionless body, his face pale, his eyes wide with horror. For a moment, the world stood still. And then, the full weight of what had just occurred crashed down on her like a tidal wave. Isabel was dead, and Rachel had killed her. The sound of Isabel's body hitting the cold, unforgiving floor echoed through the apartment like the crack of thunder in a silent storm. For a moment, everything stood still. The world outside Paris, the city of love and light, seemed to fade into a distant dream, leaving only the stark reality of what had just transpired. Rachel stood at the top of the staircase, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands still trembling as if the act of pushing Isabel had somehow burned through her skin. Her heart pounded so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But Isabel's lifeless body at the foot of the stairs told a different story. "Oh my God. What have I done?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible, choked with disbelief. Her eyes remained locked on the motionless figure below, horror etched across her face. Matthew was at her side in an instant, his hands gripping her shoulders, shaking her back to reality. "Rachel, listen to me." His voice was low, steady, but there was a tremor in it, fear, panic. He was barely holding it together himself. "We need to get out of here." "I killed her," Rachel whimpered, the reality crashing over her in waves. "I killed her, Matthew." He grabbed her, pulling her close, his arms wrapping around her as if to protect her from the weight of her own guilt. She melted into him, her body shaking with sobs. "We didn't mean for this to happen," he whispered against her hair, his breath warm on her skin. "It was an accident. But we need to act fast." Rachel felt her knees go weak, but Matthew held her up, his grip strong and commanding. There was no time for falling apart. Not now. Matthew's mind raced. They couldn't just walk out and leave Isabel's body. They had to do something. He could feel the clock ticking in the back of his mind, every second wasted bringing them closer to the point of no return. The police would be here soon. Neighbors might have heard the shouting, the crash. They couldn't wait. He had to fix this. "We'll say she fell," Matthew said, his voice firm, though the panic was simmering beneath his calm exterior. "An accident." She slipped down the stairs. It's believable he was already moving, pulling Rachel with him down the stairs toward Isabel's still form. His hands trembled as he crouched beside her, his fingers hovering just above her neck. No pulse. She was gone. Rachel's breath hitched as she looked down at Isabel's body, her eyes wide with shock. The guilt gnawed at her insides like a disease, making her stomach turn. She backed away, her hand flying to her mouth as she choked back the urge to scream, to run, to do something. Matthew was more controlled, but only just. He stood, glancing around the room, assessing, calculating. "We need to make this look like an accident." His voice was sharp, but there was a tenderness in the way he glanced at Rachel, knowing the hell she was going through. He needed to be strong for her. "We can't leave any evidence behind." Rachel stared at him, her mind racing, her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear anything over the noise. How she whispered, her voice cracking. "How do we cover this up?" Matthew stepped closer, his hands on her arms again, grounding her, anchoring her to him. "We wipe everything down. Any surface you touched, anything that could lead back to us." He glanced at the blood that had pooled beneath Isabel's head, his jaw tightening. "And we need to clean that." For the next hour, they worked in silence, the only sounds in the room the soft rustle of cloth, the squeak of shoes on the floor as they moved around the apartment, erasing every trace of themselves. Rachel's hands shook uncontrollably as she scrubbed away the evidence, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. Matthew was meticulous, cold, as if switching into survival mode. He cleaned the railing, the doorknobs, everything Rachel might have touched in her rage-fueled frenzy. But no matter how much they cleaned, the weight of what had happened lingered in the air, suffocating them both. As the last trace of blood was wiped from the floor, Matthew straightened, glancing at the clock. They needed to leave. He moved toward Rachel, his arms wrapping around her waist from behind, pulling her against him. She leaned into him, her body tense but desperate for his comfort, his strength. They stood in the eerie silence of the apartment, clinging to one another, as if the world outside would swallow them whole if they let Rachel. Matthew whispered into her hair, his lips brushing the side of her neck. "We have to go." Rachel nodded, her breath shaky as she turned in his arms, her eyes wide and glossy with unshed tears. She pressed her face into his chest, letting his warmth momentarily soothe the icy dread that had settled deep in her bones. "I'm so scared, Matthew," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "What if they find out? What if?" "Shh," he murmured, cupping her face in his hands, lifting her chin so she had to meet his gaze. His thumb brushed her cheek, wiping away the tear that escaped. "No one will find out. I'll protect you. I promise." Rachel stared into his eyes, searching for reassurance, for hope. But even in his eyes, she saw the fear, the uncertainty lurking beneath his calm exterior. He was just as terrified as she was. They left Isabel's apartment hand in hand, the night closing in around them, the weight of their shared crime settling heavily on their shoulders. The streets of Paris, once a place of romance and beauty, now felt ominous, the shadows casting doubt and fear into every corner. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing in the night, their minds racing with the same thought: had they done enough? Would anyone know? By the time they reached their hotel, the air between them had shifted. The emotional toll of what they had done, of the lies they were now entangled in, was starting to tear at the fabric of their relationship. Matthew's hand lingered on the door as they entered the room, and Rachel could feel the growing distance between them, the unspoken tension tightening around them like a noose. Once inside, Rachel collapsed onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. The enormity of the night's events was too much to bear. She could feel her sanity slipping, the guilt and fear gnawing at her from the inside. She needed Matthew to hold her, to tell her everything would be all right, but when she looked up, he was standing by the window, his back to her. "Matthew," she called softly, her voice filled with the raw vulnerability of someone on the edge of breaking. He didn't turn around immediately, his gaze fixed on the shimmering lights of Paris outside. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched in a way that made him seem miles away from her. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, hollow. "We did what we had to." Rachel felt the chasm between them widen, the emotional connection they had once shared fraying under the weight of their crime. She stood and crossed the room to him, her arms wrapping around his waist from behind, pressing herself against him, seeking the comfort she so desperately needed. Matthew turned to her, his eyes dark with regret. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. His hand reached out for hers, their fingers brushing one last time. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it carried the weight of everything they had lost. "I'm sorry too," Rachel whispered back, tears finally slipping down her cheeks. She had never imagined it would end this way. But it was too late for apologies. The final blow came when they were both formally charged with Isabel's murder. As the handcuffs clicked into place around their wrists, the once passionate lovers stood side by side, their bodies close but their hearts worlds apart. Rachel looked at Matthew one last time, her chest tightening as she realized that the man she had once loved with all her heart was now just a stranger. Their love had been built on lies and betrayal, and now it had crumbled under the weight of their sins. As they were led away through the dark, echoing halls of the police station, Rachel could feel the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into her skin. Her heart ached with the knowledge that everything was over: their love, their lives, their freedom. Matthew glanced over at her, his eyes filled with sorrow, but there was no more warmth between them. They were two broken people, lost in the wreckage of their own making. Outside, the streets of Paris bustled with life, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded within its borders. The city continued on, as it always had, while the Collinses were taken away, side by side, yet emotionally distant, two souls torn apart by their own choices. And in the end, all that was left was the memory of what they had once been, lost in the city of love, now forever tainted by death and betrayal.